In a world where at age 10 you pick your superpower, you picked the seemingly harmless one. Yet now at 26, you're considered the most powerful person in the world. Lucy always liked the little things, and not in the way you would expect. She was absolutely enamored by the idea of individual grains of sand, salt or sugar, and tiny drops of water. So when the time came for her to pick her superpower, the answer was obvious to her. I want to be able to control tiny particles like sand, salt, dust, and drops of water. The smaller the better. She quickly found that she held greater control the smaller the particle. Small grains of sand were easier to control than large ones. A few years later, she learned of the particle model of matter, and she realized just what she may have done. It took her months to work up the courage. She spent those months reading about atoms and subatomic particles. Most of it didn't make much sense, but she understood one thing very clearly. Everything is made of very, very tiny things. Things she could control. When she finally worked up the courage, she closed her eyes. Focusing on the air around her, she knew there was water vapor in the air. She started with that. She pulled, pressing it together. She opened her eyes, and there was a drop of water now hovering in the air before her. A year later, she had mastered controlling individual molecules. She could stir her drink without touching it and make water flow to her mouth. She could force airflow. She kept it secret, though, fearful of what people would think. She took up physics and chemistry in high school, wanting to understand more of what she could do. Eventually, she came to understand elementary particles, and that probably cemented the point that she became the most powerful person in the world. At 18 years old, she had learned to control the most fundamental level of matter known. In this world, it's customary to show off what you can do with your powers in a ceremony at the end of the year you turned 18. You also stated what power you chose and why. Now it was time for that ceremony. One of her good friends, Tyler, had chosen levitation as his favorite comic book character had that power. They met in year 10. When he showed off, he floated around, flying over the audience before dropping gracefully back onto the stage. One of her classmates walked onto the stage. They had chosen shapeshifting as they never felt comfortable in their own body. When they showed off, they cycled through various animals before turning into a shimmering, abstract mass, then back to their normal form, humanoid with 4 eyes, short horns, fiery hair, and a scorpion tail. Lucy walked up onto the stage. When I was 10, I was obsessed with tiny things, like grains of sand and drops of water. I chose to be able to control tiny particles. The smaller the better. This is what I can do. She emptied out the jar of sawdust she'd brought onto the ground. The particles flew through the air, swirling above her head. Then, with a deep breath to prepare herself, she squeezed oxygen around the sawdust, igniting the tiny particles of wood. The swirling flames looked like a halo to the audience. She directed the flaming particles to the sky as she extended her reach upward, pulling water in the air above the stage, commanding the airborne body of water and the flames to swirl around each other. The flames burned out and she scattered the water into a falling mist. She bowed and walked back off the stage. She'd barely shown anything, but she didn't want to detract from her peers. 2 years later, she'd fully mastered disassembling and reassembling an object, being able to piece it back together to the exact state it was in. She could create pockets of vacuum, but the crushing pressure was hard for her to hold against. Obviously, in a world where superpowers are so common, there were those who misused them. A year later, Lucy was walking down the street where a wooden construct was wreaking havoc. People were trying to fight it, but it was too powerful for any of the people there. Lucy walked over to it, commanding the particles of it to hover in the air. She pulled on it, turning the wood to dust, which fell to the ground. There was a man inside it who clearly had been controlling it. So what was all that for, huh? She asked the floating man. He spouted off some bullshit about the world needing to be cleansed of the weak or something. Since it wasn't a valid reason, Lucy didn't care. She pulled on the dust, reconfiguring its matter to bind him. She then left him to the mercy of the people who he'd been trying to kill. Unfortunately, many people believe that only the strong should live, and that the weak should either die or serve the strong. Another year later, Lucy took up a bit of a hobby, dealing with these kinds of people. She encountered one at least twice a week, wreaking havoc on the people. The harder ones were the ones who manipulated energy rather than matter, but their bodies were still matter, so she could knock them out. She wasn't invested enough to look for any kind of leader. She figured that there probably wasn't one. 4 more years later, she was watching the news. The International Superpower Association had announced the current most powerful person in the world. For the person's privacy, they never revealed a person's name. The current most powerful person is a woman who has complete dominance over matter. She is a terrifying force to be reckoned with and seems to have made something of a habit of taking out power supremacists. Despite her extreme power, we don't consider her a threat to people. She has shown no desire to harm the people. It seems instead she'd just rather go about her day. Lucy froze. They were talking about her. She was the most powerful person in the world. That little girl who'd been so obsessed with tiny things like sand that she chose to be able to control them. That naive little girl was the most powerful person alive.